Squidward is a character who has borne the brunt of the most punishment throughout the entire SpongeBob series. Of all the criticisms of SpongeBob episodes, one of the most common ones will revolve around how this character is treated. But are these complaints justified? Or is Squidward torture a valid way to deliver the message of an episode? Prologue. Security system. Whenever I think of the concept of Squidward torture, I can't help but think of
security system takes control of Squidward's house and begins attacking the city.
If you're not familiar with this clip, it's a popular meme that's used to poke fun at SpongeBob video essayists. I did a little more research into the original video, and it turns out that it was actually a broader review of the video maker's top 10 most hated SpongeBob episodes. The original video actually was taken down by the creator, so as I talk about this clip and the original video, please know that I am not intending to make fun of this person because they clearly weren't trying to make some kind of serious critique and were just messing around and talking about some episodes of the show they didn't like. The actual reason I want to examine this video is because I think it's a great opportunity to discuss how cartoon reviews have evolved over the past decade and examine what a more surface level review of an episode looks like so that we can discuss how to properly examine media in a deeper way. It's hard to pinpoint when exactly the original video was posted, as I could only find re-uploads, not the original video. So if I had to guess, this video came out sometime in 2014 to 2015, and I think that not just because of the proximity to the episodes discussed within it, but because that was around the era that reviewing media on YouTube started to pick up steam. So the iconic clip happens within a broader review of the episode Good Neighbors, which is an episode that revolves around SpongeBob trying so hard to be a good neighbor that he ends up ruining Squidward's day off. At the end of the episode, Squidward gets a security system to keep out SpongeBob and Patrick, but when it doesn't work, he starts smacking it, and then, well, the rest is history.
Security system takes control of Squidward's house.
So the main criticism that this little rant levies is that Squidward did not deserve the episode's ending punishment. The criticism itself is valid, actually. Squidward's treatment in this episode is not narratively deserved. But while the reviewer was correct in their assessment of the writing, where the review is lacking is in the actual examination of the writing and the story. And I think this is best illustrated by this comment.
All Squidward wanted to do was enjoy one day to himself, but that can never happen when he lives next door to SpongeBob and Patrick, can it?
So this is a common review pitfall, where you criticize the episode as if you are someone who exists within the world, and as if the characters are real people. Like, if this situation happened in real life to real people, silly as it sounds, you would probably say something like this. But this outlook does ignore why things actually occur in a narrative. Like, this moment isn't poor writing because something bad happened to a character. It's poor writing because that bad thing that happened to that character was not narratively deserved. To further illustrate how this attitude can negatively impact critical analysis, let's look at what the video maker had to say about the episode Penny Foolish from this very same video.
The episode revolves around Mr. Krabs spotting SpongeBob with a penny, and he becomes obsessed with the damn thing.
Dude, it's just a penny.
The video maker criticizes this episode by talking about how unreasonable it is for Mr. Krabs to get so obsessed with a penny. But that's the point of the episode. The entire lesson of the episode revolves around how becoming obsessed with something so minor can have negative consequences, and Krabs' actions tell that story. So while the video maker's attitude of criticizing the characters as if they were real people correctly identified Good Neighbors as a poorly written episode, that same attitude applied to what I think is a great episode, Penny Foolish, ends up unfairly criticizing the episode and ignoring its narrative implications. And again, I don't say this to bash this one video maker. I say this because this attitude is more common than you think, and it's a symptom of broader media illiteracy. While video making has certainly evolved from this grainy, poor audio quality of the mid-2010s, the epidemic of criticizing characters from this shallow surface level still persists. I mean, just look at how "what would X character's prison sentence be" is one of the most common content farm video subjects. And look, sometimes taking fictional universes seriously like this can be a good thing. You could make videos on theories, morality scaling, and yes, even a non-content farm version of applying real-world laws to fictional characters that are meant to teach people about how those laws work. While all of those are valid forms of content, many of which are made by talented creators, they aren't reviews. And if you are going to do a critical analysis of the writing of something, you have to put yourself outside of the world. What critical analyses like these misunderstand is the concept of a character being narratively deserving of something. A story is nothing more than a communication of a perspective that the author of that story thinks that we should hold, and the most common way of telling a story is to have a character hold the opposite perspective of the one that you, the author, agree with, and have them either choose to change that perspective or be punished for refusing to change. The punishment, if implemented correctly, would be considered narratively deserved. A story being poorly written is when an author doesn't really think too hard on what kind of perspective they are communicating, and instead focus on surface-level situations, which is exactly what I think happened with the writing of Good Neighbors. Since any story communicates a perspective just by being a story at all, Good Neighbors focuses on the concept of trying too hard to be helpful and making things worse in the process. This is a good lesson to teach, but the narrative fails to properly teach this lesson because it spends so much of its runtime punishing Squidward instead of SpongeBob, even though Squidward isn't the one who holds the negative perspective that the narrative is supposed to be criticizing. The reason I think this happened is because in most other episodes of the show, Squidward is the one who holds a negative perspective and gets punished for it. So this episode uses the structure of Squidward getting punished, but gives SpongeBob the negative perspective instead, without meaningfully shifting around the structure. See what I just did there? I have the same criticism of the episode as the security system rant, but because I identified the actual writing flaws rather than criticizing the situation itself, I was able to actually teach a potential viewer or writer how to identify good or bad writing in media, which is the main purpose of critical analysis. So let's apply this same critical principle to examine 9 Squidward torture episodes from classic SpongeBob to middle SpongeBob to modern SpongeBob, and answer the central question of this video. Is Squidward torture bad writing? Chapter 1. Jellyfishing. Jellyfishing is often used as a counter-argument to the idea that Squidward torture is a phenomenon unique to post-movie SpongeBob. If you look at some of the incidents in the episode and compare them to later Squidward torture, you will find that they both do, in fact, have bad things happen to Squidward. However, if your issue with episodes like this is something bad happens to a character, then maybe cartoons aren't exactly for you. Something bad happening to a character happens in every cartoon, every story even. The place where we can find valid criticism is if the bad things that happen to a character are either narratively deserved, or if they aren't narratively deserved, motivate the story. Each bad thing that happens to Squidward in Jellyfishing is a direct result of the character flaw that the episode is trying to criticize: antisocial behavior. When Squidward is invited jellyfishing by SpongeBob and Patrick, he rejects them in an insincere and sarcastic way, instead of politely declining by saying, "No, jellyfishing isn't my interest." He also isn't upfront in the rejection itself, acting like he can't go jellyfishing because he has something else to do, rather than being honest and just saying he doesn't want to. This leads to 2 negative consequences: Squid following a jellyfish and falling off his bike because he was distracted biking while gloating about his recent rudeness, and him subsequently being unable to refuse hanging out with SpongeBob and Patrick while injured because, after all, he didn't ever explain to them that he didn't want their company. From Sponge and Pat's perspective, Squidward wants them to have a party with him and go jellyfishing, and the negative things that happen to Squidward are a result of his own insincerity. And really, not that much severely bad happens to Squidward at the hands of SpongeBob and Patrick, at least compared to later Squidward torture episodes. He gets some hot soup blown on his face, has to listen to some bad music, and of course, firmly grasp it. But I find these narrative punishments pretty mild if you look at them for what they are: ways of communicating Squidward's character flaws. To compare this episode to Good Neighbors, where we see Squid get paint in his eyes, get blasted by a laser, get sentenced to a lifetime of community service, all of which communicate nothing about any sort of character flaw, What happens in Jellyfishing is narratively sound. The final punishment for Squidward in Jellyfishing is when he gets attacked by the giant jellyfish. This is narratively deserved because just before the giant jellyfish appears, he needlessly harms a little jellyfish. This final punishment is an extension of Squidward's initial character flaw of insincerity, combined with the subject of the episode, jellyfishing as a sport. The opening action sequence of the episode shows SpongeBob and Patrick taking the craft of jellyfishing quite seriously, and then later in the episode, they try to explain to Squidward some of the nuances of the sport with a little da-da-da-da-da sequence. Because Squidward is so resistant to embracing jellyfish as a concept, he ends up getting himself blasted to bits. So I said earlier that this episode teaches a lesson about how to properly reject someone when they ask you to do an activity you aren't interested in. And while you can take that lesson from this episode, I think it is also a lesson on how you shouldn't be so closed-minded to new experiences. The episode communicates, I think, that Squidward would have enjoyed jellyfishing if he just gave it a chance, and all of his punishment in the episode comes from resisting an activity that he would have enjoyed anyway. I should also address one other element of this episode that is often criticized about it, and that is the fact that Squidward spends most of the episode in a full body cast and wheelchair, and him not being able to communicate or move freely because of that is a source of conflict in the story, and even the source of some of the episode's jokes. I will not deny that this is in poor taste when looked at in a modern lens. The main reason I think that the writers went with this as their plot is because since Squidward is not permanently disabled, it wasn't seen as bad, even though it was. It's a product of its time, indeed, and I would be remiss to not point out this flaw. Another thing that makes this a more narratively well-crafted Squidward torture episode is that SpongeBob and Patrick get meaningfully punished as well. While Squidward is the character with the more major character flaw and thus bears the brunt of more of the episode's punishment, the narrative does also criticize the naivete of SpongeBob and Patrick. There even is a moment where Patrick questions if Squidward doesn't like them. Yeah, remember when Patrick was the smart one? But even with this question, SpongeBob does go ahead thinking that Squidward actually does want to hang out with them, and they get a bunch of jellyfish zaps throughout the episode to punish them for their own ignorance. They even actually say sorry at the very end before getting their last punishment of Squidward letting out the jellyfish to attack them before Squidward's final bigger punishment. It's a situation where all the characters are in some way in the wrong, which makes for a more compelling story. Again, to compare this to Good Neighbors, even though SpongeBob and Patrick received the same punishment as Squidward in the end with lifetime community service, they don't react negatively to it. In fact, they see it as a positive, so in a way, they didn't even really get punished. Even though in Good Neighbors, SpongeBob was the one who had the character flaw, not Squidward. So narratively, only SpongeBob and Patrick should have been punished. Jellyfishing, by comparison, is much more balanced. Sponge and Pat are flawed, Squidward is a little more flawed, and the punishments of the episode reflect that. So, with the poor taste in the wheelchair joke set aside, it is a really solid narrative. Chapter 2. Club SpongeBob. Club SpongeBob is an episode I talked about in a previous video, but in that video I focused more on how the episode comments on religion, and because of that I talked more about the actions of SpongeBob and Patrick, though I feel like that video was lacking in discussing Squidward's character flaw, so I will rectify that here. The conflict of Club SpongeBob revolves around SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward getting stuck in the kelp forest, and since SpongeBob and Patrick believe in the divine authority of the magic conch, they deny Squidward access to food because he is a non-believer. While the narrative does a good job at illustrating Sponge and Pat's susceptibility to magical thinking, the narrative also criticizes the behavior of Squidward as well. Squidward's insistence that he might be right causes him to immediately resist any mention of the magic conch, calling it a stupid toy. This teaches a very real lesson about how not to deal with unreasonable people. Oftentimes, being immediately dismissive makes it difficult to navigate tricky situations, even if you are the one who is logically in the right. Or sometimes it's best to completely disengage from unreasonable people, which Squidward fails to do at the beginning of the episode where he just cannot stand that Sponge and Pat told him that he wouldn't fit into their club. If he had just gone about his day not caring what Sponge and Pat believed, he never would have ended up in the kelp forest in the first place. But because, due to his own arrogance, he just had to be right, he ended up stuck in the wilderness at the behest of the very thing he tried to argue against. As far as actual torture moments go, this is definitely more of a psychological and I guess hunger-based torture as opposed to other kinds of episodes where he gets physically smacked around. I mean, the bug hits him with a stick, but that's really about it. Regardless, because the bad things that happen to Squidward are meant to communicate how not to deal with unreasonable people, everything that happens to Squidward in this episode is, in fact, narratively deserved. Chapter 3: The Camping Episode. The reason Squidward ends up in a bad situation in the camping episode is actually similar to the inciting incident of Club SpongeBob. Since Squidward was desperate to prove that he is a better outdoorsman than Sponge and Pat, and because he misreads SpongeBob's "have fun inside" comment to be backhanded, he decides to go camping outside his house, just like how in Club SpongeBob, he was desperate to prove that he belonged in their club and misread the "you won't fit in" comment. The main conflict in the camping episode revolves around the sea bear and teaches the lesson to hear out and listen to others' warnings when you are in a survival situation, even when the warnings themselves sound silly. While the cartoonish things that attract a sea bear, like cubed cheese and clown shoes, aren't exactly realistic outdoorsy warnings, there may be some real-world precautions that might sound equally as silly. So by seeing Squidward get attacked by the sea bear for not heeding these instructions, it further illustrates the lesson of setting aside your own arrogance and listening to the people around you. Another thing that the camping episode excels in is its pacing and the way its writing choices take you on a journey with the characters. The episode does a good job of making you feel like you're both out in the wilderness and right next to the houses. It accomplishes this by taking a few lines to hammer home how Squidward can't just go back to his house, even though it's right nearby, with the whole can opener barnacle balls exchange. The episode also has some more low-stakes conflicts, like Squidward setting up the tent and getting hit by molten foodstuffs, and how could I forget, the campfire song, which perfectly illustrates the characters' differing attitudes and leads perfectly into the sea bear tone shift. Then, once the sea bear actually attacks, the episode does a good job of communicating that Squidward is getting hurt without making it too gruesome, as the actual sea bear attacks happen off-screen, with a focus on SpongeBob and Patrick's reactions and Squidward's beat-up self afterward. Each escalating thing that angers the sea bear just gets funnier and funnier.
They hate limping more than running!
Culminating in one attack that there is seemingly no reason for, which is explained by,
I don't know, I guess he just doesn't like you!
Which is not only funny due to its absurdity, but almost feels like a comment on the idea of something being narratively deserved. Then, once Squidward finally accepts SpongeBob and Patrick's advice, he still gets one final implied punishment from the sea rhinoceros, since the only way to prevent getting attacked by those is to have special underwear. The final cherry on top for the episode, and giving one final lesson that you need to be prepared when doing something dangerous like camping. All in all, the camping episode is one of those SpongeBob episodes that just does not waste a single second of its 11-minute runtime. It sets up an incredibly simple narrative with an easy-to-understand lesson and then just rolls with it with strong pacing and perfectly set up jokes. It is truly, in my opinion, the best Squidward torture episode out there, and definitive proof that Squidward torture in and of itself isn't bad writing as long as said torture is used to comment on Squidward's character flaw, which is usually some version of arrogance. In looking at these three classic SpongeBob episodes, we can see that the show absolutely understood this, but as we get into discussing middle SpongeBob, did they keep up this level of writing quality? Chapter 4: Choir Boys. Choir Boys is one of the most infamous middle SpongeBob Squidward torture episodes, but is this infamy actually deserved? Something that sets this episode apart from most other Squidward torture episodes is the absence of Patrick. And I think there is something to be said about how when Patrick is not involved, it makes some of the more ignorant actions of SpongeBob seem a little less understandable. When it's two guys being silly, you can kind of get that they're making these mistakes because they're playing off each other. And because the negative actions are split between two different characters, they both don't come off as bad. When it's only SpongeBob causing the harm, there's no other character taking the negativity off him, so he just kind of sponges all the negativity up, pun absolutely intended. The premise of Choir Boys is that Squidward wants to join the Bikini Bottom Men's Choir, and the first few minutes of the episode actually do a pretty good job at setting up how much Squidward wants to get in, and also communicates that he probably is going to fail due to showing us his lack of singing skill. Oh yeah, there's also this one joke where Squidward walks out of his bathroom and his toilet is sad and has this little exchange with the toilet paper.
Don't feel bad. He didn't use me yesterday either.
It's just a weird moment, and the joke not only doesn't make sense, but it has nothing to do with the broader story. I think it's an indication that the writers are kind of grasping at straws comedy-wise in this episode. Not a great sign for what's to come. The episode does make a lot of writing decisions on the part of SpongeBob that make him kind of unlikable. Him just lying on the ground, him going, can I come, over and over again. Even in a cartoonish world, these read as awkward and childish actions, and not in the usually endearing SpongeBob-y way. Another thing that this episode lacks is Squidward having any bearing on the episode's inciting incident. In Jellyfishing, Squidward actively chooses to be disingenuous in rejecting SpongeBob. In Club SpongeBob, he chooses to climb up into the clubhouse. In the camping episode, he chooses to go camping. In Choir Boys, he doesn't really make any strong choice, other than stopping and gloating a little bit when he sees SpongeBob on the ground and saying no when SpongeBob asks if he can accompany him. And all of the subsequent bad things that happen to Squidward, I guess, are supposed to be narrative consequences to that. Like, I suppose it's not nice for Squidward to try and gatekeep the audition and assume that SpongeBob is not good enough to be in the choir, but the narrative didn't really make a compelling case as to why SpongeBob should audition for the choir. SpongeBob's reason for being so sad and laying on the ground is because Patrick is away and he's bored. But that doesn't really line up with someone who would want to join a prestigious choir. There's a moment where SpongeBob pretty humbly says that he might not be good enough but still wants to share his voice, which is something, but I still think the narrative didn't really do a good job at expressing why SpongeBob should be someone who deserves to join the choir and Squidward not. The most hurt Squidward gets in this episode is when he flies into Jellyfish Fields and SpongeBob sings for a captive audience. It's one of those moments where SpongeBob is completely ignorant that Squidward is getting hurt at all. And if you take a look at any of the classic Squidward torture episodes, SpongeBob is aware of every single time Squidward gets hurt, except for maybe firmly grasp it. Here he is reacting to the soup, reacting to the sea bear. He's not supposed to be so oblivious that he wouldn't realize Squidward is getting stung by a bunch of jellyfish. Then Squidward gets fed up with SpongeBob and ties him to a piece of coral to keep him from bothering him. This moment is played as this low point for SpongeBob. The whole tone of the scene makes it like it's some kind of empowering moment when he makes the jellyfish carry him out to the choir building where he sings the final song. But the main issue with this is that it didn't really portray SpongeBob as an underdog. Like, a moment like this, with its framing, pacing, and sound design, could have come off as a really powerful turning point for the story, but the story did not do a good job at making you root for SpongeBob, so the whole vibe it's going for just falls flat. There's a moment where SpongeBob seemingly does something nice and says that he'll only accept the position in the choir if Squidward can be a part of it too, which cuts to the concert where Squidward is the page turner. And honestly, I think that's almost a worse punishment than him just not getting in the choir at all. Like, he has to watch someone else live his dream. And yes, I get that's the point, but since the episode really didn't do that good of a job at illustrating Squidward's arrogance, other than a couple of rude lines, this just doesn't feel deserved. So I get what this episode was trying to say. Squidward doesn't deserve to be in the choir, and SpongeBob does. And the episode does show us that Squidward isn't talented, and SpongeBob is, so narratively this is solid, right? Well, no, because what the episode failed to engage in is why Squidward isn't talented and why SpongeBob is. An episode that succeeded in this was Artist Unknown, which, is that a Squidward torture episode? I guess it kind of is, but it's not one of the main subjects of the video. Anyway, similarly to Choir Boys, Artist Unknown has Squidward fail and SpongeBob succeed at an artistic task, but Artist Unknown demonstrated why SpongeBob was a better artist than Squidward. SpongeBob was more open-minded and didn't do things by the book, as Squidward tried to preach. And also, Squidward only considers something good art if it looks like him, further illustrating his own arrogance. And sure, in Choir Boys, Squidward is seen as cocky, but beyond that, there really isn't much that communicates that he hasn't worked well enough as a singer to get into the choir. What the episode really needed to lean into was a story about accepting that someone close to you is chosen for a position that you wanted. Probably would have been better off with an ending where Squidward made it into the choir, but just not as the lead vocalist, and have SpongeBob be the one who got the lead instead. That way, if someone watching the episode were in Squidward's position, as just about everyone has been in some point in their life, they can engage with a more meaningful lesson. Someone shouldn't be content as a page turner if they wanted to be in the choir, but they should learn to be content in a smaller role and hope to practice and move up next time. If the story had focused on that, it would have been a lot better, and it probably would have been able to come up with a lot better jokes and gags once it had a better understanding of what it was trying to say. Chapter 5. Slide Whistle Stooges. Slide Whistle Stooges is an episode that is defined by one central problem. The entire episode leans on the fact that there are slide whistles. It is the definition of a gimmick episode. The story is weak. The jokes are weak. The characters are weak. But we get to hear slide whistle versions of the background music, so yay. Much of the beginning revolves around SpongeBob and Patrick annoying Squidward by excessively playing slide whistle. The narrative didn't establish Squidward as doing anything wrong that deserves this excessive slide whistling, and Squidward getting tortured by their incessant playing doesn't make any sort of comment about Squidward's past behavior. So it ends up just being a bunch of meaningless noise, literally. Eventually, Squidward just kind of changes on a dime and starts to embrace the slide whistle. Since the story is so weak, there isn't really anything that makes me believe Squidward's sudden change in attitude. The narrative then kind of tries to teach a lesson about how Squidward takes the slide whistling too far, with him harassing people with it and stealing a truck and whatnot. This leads to a final punishment where Squidward gets a slide whistle permanently lodged in his throat. What this episode fails in the most is its complete imbalance in punishment and unbelievability of character actions. SpongeBob and Patrick harass Squidward and get no consequences. Squidward harasses others and faces consequences, so the narrative tries to compensate for this by having Squidward commit far worse acts with his slide whistle. But that just makes things worse, because I don't really believe that the character would suddenly act this way. I could tell that this episode's production was 100% revolved around how do we do as many slide whistle gags as possible. Because of that, the story completely failed. Chapter 6. That Sinking Feeling. That Sinking Feeling is our resident good Squidward torture episode from Middle SpongeBob. Yes, they did exist. I wanted to talk about this episode right after Slide Whistle Stooges because it's kind of the anti-Slide Whistle Stooges in a lot of ways. They're both episodes where SpongeBob and Patrick annoy Squidward and lead to a lot of destruction happening. But where this episode succeeds and Slide Whistle Stooges fails is that in That Sinking Feeling, the narrative criticizes the actions of Squidward and SpongeBob and Patrick and relays consequences accordingly. In the episode, Squidward is annoyed by SpongeBob and Patrick running through his yard. In an attempt to stop SpongeBob and Patrick, Squidward sets a rule that they are not allowed to cross onto his property. What makes Squidward's later punishments more narratively deserved is that Squidward outright chose to involve himself in this situation. It's not like Good Neighbors or Slide Whistle Stooges where they just straight up appear inside his house. Sponge and Pat are definitely a bit more childish in this episode than in the classic episodes, but honestly, it doesn't really go too far here. Their childishness does kind of feed into the story pretty nicely. The narrative also does a good job at making us feel like there isn't really any good solution to this problem, even though the problem itself is nothing more than a literal line in the sand. There's a few moments that make this problem seem impenetrable, almost insurmountable. It even does a good job of answering the obvious question of why don't you just cross the street, with a car coming by the second SpongeBob steps foot in the street. It's sequences like this that I think are a great indicator of why it's better to look at shows narratively rather than literally. If we looked at this episode like the security system criticizing reviewer I talked about at the beginning of this video, we would probably say something along the lines of, why didn't SpongeBob and Patrick just cross over the line? Or why didn't they just go in the street, since SpongeBob goes in that street all the time to go to the Krusty Krab? Or why didn't they just go behind the house? These criticisms, if you were to make them, are unproductive in the face of looking at what narratively a story is trying to communicate. The point of the story is that SpongeBob and Patrick are taking this barrier so seriously that they resort to a drastic way of circumventing it. And when we look at the story that way, we can appreciate it for what it is trying to do. SpongeBob and Patrick's character flaw in this episode is that of malicious compliance. They don't disobey Squidward's boundary, but they do find a way around it through digging underground, leading to Squidward's house sinking. This then escalates when Squidward attacks SpongeBob and Patrick and ends up sinking all of Bikini Bottom. In the end, SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward all face the consequence of having to live some kind of subterranean mining life, but Squidward definitely seems a bit more annoyed by it. This is kind of similar to Good Neighbors, where even though they have the same punishment, Squidward is more affected by it, but in this episode, it works a bit better, because 1, Squidward did have a character flaw that was worth punishing, and 2, SpongeBob and Patrick were genuinely distressed when Squidward was chasing them, communicating acknowledgement of their own wrongdoing. That sinking feeling is kind of a diamond in the rough as far as episodes like this go in this era. I think it goes to show that I'm not really asking for too much in order to say that something succeeds as a narrative. Is this episode as good as the classic SpongeBob episodes? No. Those episodes were funnier and their messages were a little stronger. But this episode is still far and above the other middle SpongeBob examples I talked about in this video, just because the narrative punishments line up with the actions the characters committed. So with all that in mind, let's see what Squidward torture looks like in modern SpongeBob. Chapter 7. Ink Lemonade. Ink Lemonade is an episode of SpongeBob that represents, I think, the worst of the entire series. But funnily enough, not so much because of Squidward torture. Sure, Squidward's narrative punishments are a little bit harsh. He really gets worked over in this episode. And the worst thing he did was throw a lemon in Patrick's eye, which I guess is a pretty messed up thing to do. But Patrick didn't really react to it much, so it kind of feels cartoon logic-y, you know? Like, yes, it would be terrible to throw a lemon in someone's eye in real life, but in the cartoon world, it obviously didn't like blind him or anything, so it was more of just a slapstick thing. The lemon throw also isn't indicative of any broader character flaw that the narrative wants to comment on. If anything, Patrick is the one with the character flaw because he administers this torture on Squidward in order to take his ink, but Patrick learns no lesson and receives no punishment for these actions. So yeah, narrative lesson-wise, this episode is a complete wash, but I can hardly focus on the episode's bad writing in the face of its primary flaw, the gross out. To be fair to the modern SpongeBob of the season 14, 15, 16-ish era, from what I've seen of it, the gross out and violent moments have been pretty toned down. But back here in season 11, they were really out there. Where to even begin? I mean, all the inking stuff is just so unpleasant. You know, obviously human beings don't spray ink out of their noses, but you know what does come out of our noses sometimes? Blood. So every time we get these inking scenes, that's all I'm thinking about. They even go out of their way to have Squidward with tissues in his nose after the initial inking the same way someone would stop a bloody nose, just in case he didn't already have that association. Also, on the subject of blood, there's even this one moment where Patrick tries to squeeze a toy fire truck because he didn't know what a lemon is, and cartoon logic makes it spill out this red liquid that kind of makes me think of blood. I don't know, there's a lot of weird stuff going on here. I get really bad vibes from this episode. There's also Patrick peeling off his skin to scare Squidward. Seriously, did anyone find this funny? What's the joke? And to make matters worse, the entire premise of the episode is that it's one of those everyone wants to eat/drink this delicious thing only to find out that the way it's made is super gross kind of cartoon episodes, which is just an awful trope, except when they did it in the South Park Asperger's episode, but the whole point of them using the trope in that episode was to comment on their own show running on for so long, and they used it to prop up the emotional through line of the story. Oh yeah, I guess there's that one Rick and Morty episode with the pasta that did that trope really well too. Okay, so it's not an inherently bad trope, but it's a bad trope in Ink Lemonade because it doesn't use it for any sort of lesson or anything. It just uses it to make you uncomfortable. And it's okay to make your audience uncomfortable if you're trying to make them actually think about something. But this episode is just making you uncomfortable because they can make you uncomfortable, and that's what makes it not work. The only part of the episode that is even somewhat redeemable is that after scaring Squidward with a bunch of generic scary stuff, Patrick builds a fake Krusty Krab and convinces Squidward that he's seeing the future where he still works there, revealing Squidward's biggest fear is working at the Krusty Krab for the rest of his life. In a good narrative, that would have been a pretty strong joke, but here, it's hard to enjoy. Oh yeah, and this is the smallest nitpick, but I'd be remiss if I didn't put this out, but this is also one of those modern SpongeBob episodes that has really awfully paced scenes where the characters are just making meme-worthy faces and grunting. So yeah, all this episode needed was a my leg gag and a Nosferatu appearance, and it would truly have all of the worst of SpongeBob. I don't really know how I would fix this episode. If you've seen my video where I rewrote the Splinter, which if you didn't, link in the description, I talked about how hard it is to rewrite gross out episodes because they fundamentally don't have any story beyond the thing that's grossing you out. So their premises don't lend themselves to telling any kind of meaningful story. And I gotta say, Ink Lemonade makes the Splinter look like Shakespeare. I don't usually do this when I criticize an episode, but I'm gonna say that Ink Lemonade is one of the few stories that I think never should have been told. This is not a judgment I make lightly, and I think, as of now, this is the only SpongeBob episode I've ever made this judgment on. Ever. And I've reviewed a lot of bad SpongeBob episodes. It takes a lot for me to literally believe that a piece of media is straight up invalid. It's a call I usually reserve for either hateful propaganda or anything made by AI. But considering that Ink Lemonade might literally be a story that exists just to make people uncomfortable, I'm confidently saying that I think it should have never been made. Chapter 8. Plain to See. Plain to See is a Squidward torture episode that I think might be the most narratively undeserved in the entire series. In Good Neighbors, Choir Boys, and Ink Lemonade, he was like a little mean. Not mean enough to justify his narrative punishments, but still at least something. This episode just straight up ignored that a character has to do something wrong in order to get punished for it. Like the writers of the episode just slept through that part of their writing class. The worst Squidward does in this episode is he just says,
"Wonder if I can return to sender,"
when SpongeBob and Patrick's butts are sticking out of his mailbox. Is that supposed to be what makes him deserve what happened to him throughout this episode? Man, that's some really strict karmic justice. You know what's something I love about storytelling? A good story lets you live out something exciting. You know, in episodes like Jellyfishing and the camping episode, you really feel like you're there with the characters in these fun settings. But you know what's not a fun setting? An airplane. That's all this episode is, just a bunch of things happening while on a plane. Most of which torture Squidward. And look, you can set an episode of a show in what is usually a boring place. If you tell the story right, you can make just about any place interesting. Like that one Seinfeld episode that was all about Elaine getting stuck in coach while Jerry lives it up in first class. That episode succeeds despite taking place primarily in an airplane because the situation is used to make a statement about how wildly different two people's experiences could be on a plane just based on what seat they ended up in.
You know, our goal should be a society without classes.
And also, all of the bad things that happen to Elaine in the episode are a result of her being an all-around pretty rude person, as established in the beginning of the episode when she didn't want to tip the bag handler. So back to Plain to See. After a bunch of slapstick and Squidward torture, none of which got any laughs out of me, we get to the typical cartoon on a plane episode climax where something happens to the pilot and main character has to land the plane. And when you manufacture a situation like this, you really have to put in the work to make us care about the safety of the characters. The narrative has made no effort in convincing me that these are real people in a real situation. So what do I care if the plane crashes? And then once the plane lands, it's revealed that it was on autopilot and that it's flying back home because, get it, he didn't win a trip to stay at the Hawaii-like place, he just won the chance to see it, and he saw it, so he's going back. I hate this twist. Not because of what the twist is, because it could be a good twist, but because it's narratively undeserved. Also, it's the exact same ending as good old what's-his-name. In that episode, Squidward competes with SpongeBob to learn more Krusty Krab customer names, and Squidward takes the competition so seriously he goes to jail by stealing the wallet of the final unnamed customer. And then he finds out in jail that the prize, which he thought was a vacation, was just the brochure for the vacation. What makes this ending work while Plain to See's doesn't is because good old what's-his-name comments on Squidward's character flaw of over-competitiveness and rash action, and uses the fact that the prize wasn't even that valuable in the first place as a way of further teaching that lesson. What does the plane turning around actually mean to this episode's lesson? Since the episode has no lesson, nothing. The final twist is used as just another in a long list of bad things that happen to Squidward, and that's all this episode is. Just a bunch of bad things happening to a character for no reason. Chapter 9, Friendversary. So, for the final episode I'm covering in this video, I wanted to end on a good one. Friendversary is an episode that finally seems to understand the point of narrative punishment and using a character's pain to comment on their flaws and relationships. The opening scenes of Friendversary might, at first glance, seem like undeserved Squidward torture. And yes, it is true that what Squidward deals with in this little joke montage where he gets all beaten up because of SpongeBob's shenanigans are not narratively deserved. However, something being narratively deserved is not the only valid reason a character could have something bad happen to them. The other valid reason is to motivate the story, and Squidward's torture at the beginning of the episode does just that. It motivates the story. Because Squidward so hated his Friendversary with SpongeBob, he decides to take some action and erases himself from SpongeBob's memory so that he doesn't have to deal with him anymore. This is the big mistake he makes in the episode that makes the torture he goes through in the second half of the episode, which is much worse than the first half, narratively deserved. When Krabs finds out that Squidward erased SpongeBob's memory of him, he tells him he needs to get it back because it turns out the combination to the safe that includes the secret formula was in one of those memories because SpongeBob held his Squidward-related memories in such high regard, he stored it there. Oh, how sweet. This teaches the lesson that the people around you aren't so easily removed, and there may be more to the memories of people than you may think that you don't appreciate until they're gone. It's good to see with an episode like Friendversary that even when modern SpongeBob engages in a kind of episode that is prone to being very bad, like a Squidward torture episode, sometimes they can step up and create something great. Squidward torture, I think, is a little bit rarer in modern SpongeBob than it was in middle SpongeBob. It still happens from time to time, But I think the writers have moved on to other things and found that perhaps this guy has been punished enough throughout the series. Hey, thank you so much for watching. If you like what you see, please consider subscribing to my Patreon or becoming a channel member. If you want to see more from me, I've got more scripted content on the right, or if you're looking for a little unscripted content, click on the left. See you next time.